Grace Calloway thought the story was over when her stepson left her on that dirt road. At 78 years old, with one suitcase in her hand and a silver locket at her throat, she stood in the brutal Texas heat and watched the car disappear in a cloud of dust. Behind her was the life she had built for 50 years. Ahead of her was nothing she could name. No home. No plan. No one coming to save her. So she walked. And somewhere past exhaustion, past humiliation, past the moment where grief becomes something quieter and more dangerous, Grace found an open gate and a ranch house sitting alone beneath the wide Texas sky. She stepped inside only looking for shade. Instead, she found herself. Not in a mirror. On the walls. Hundreds of paintings. Grace as a girl. Grace in a garden. Grace laughing. Grace grieving. Grace growing older. Every age, every season, every face she had worn across a lifetime, captured by someone who had seen her more clearly than she had ever known. And then the man who painted them walked through the door. He was not a stranger. He was the man she had been told died 57 years earlier. And in the space of one breath, everything Grace thought she knew about her past began to fall apart. For 51 years, Grace Calloway belonged to the house on Meridian Hill as completely as the Roses did. She arrived there at 27, a new bride stepping into a family home far grander than anything she had known growing up. The Calloway house was not simply large. It was storied. Built in 1901, it carried the weight of generations in its wraparound porches, tall windows, and deep gardens. But what made it beloved was not the architecture. It was what Grace did with it. She made it alive. She learned every season of that house the way some women learn a language. She knew which porch caught the gentlest breeze in August, which roses needed cutting back early, which floors creaked before storms. She kept the gardens blooming, hosted church luncheons and holiday gatherings, opened the doors for neighbors in grief and celebration, and turned a proud old family property into a home people actually felt welcome inside. She raised Edward's daughter there. She buried pets beneath the oaks. She folded 50 years of ordinary love into the walls through meals, repairs, traditions, and small careful acts no one writes into legal documents because they are too human to quantify. That was the tragedy no court paper could capture. Grace was not living in the Calloway house by permission. She had spent half a century becoming part of the reason it mattered. So when people later spoke as if it were only property, only square footage and inheritance and title, they were speaking about a shell. Grace knew what it had really been. It had been a life. When Edward died, Grace did what women like her have always done. She kept going. She handled the casseroles, the sympathy cards, the calls from distant relatives, the flowers that arrived too late and wilted too fast. She thanked people. She chose hymns. She sat through the funeral in black with her back straight and her hands folded and the deep private shock of a woman whose life has been split cleanly into before and after. That was when Thomas moved. Not dramatically. Not with shouting or obvious cruelty. With paperwork. He arrived 3 days after the funeral with an attorney's tone and a son's face, speaking softly about estate administration, timing, signatures, routine legal necessities. Grace, grief-stricken and exhausted, signed where he indicated. It was not carelessness. It was bereavement, that suspended, blurred condition in which ordinary judgment becomes difficult because your world has just gone missing and people keep asking you to initial things. Weeks later, details began to shift. Calls were redirected. Financial access narrowed. Conversations that had once included her now happened around her. When she finally had the documents reviewed properly, the truth emerged piece by piece. Thomas had used that window of mourning to slip through provisions that stripped away her claim to the house. He had not forged anything. He had done something colder. He had relied on her grief to do the work for him. That was the true beginning of the betrayal. Not the day he threw her out. The day he realized a widow in mourning was easier to outmaneuver than a woman fully awake. Thomas arrived on a Thursday morning in August with 2 men, a locksmith, and the calm efficiency of someone who had already decided the outcome. That was what made it so brutal. Not rage. Not mess. Procedure. He stood in Grace's front hall, in the house she had tended for 51 years, and told her she had 2 hours to gather what she needed. His voice was level, almost professional, as if he were discussing a maintenance issue instead of dismantling the final structure of her life. Behind him, the locksmith waited with his tools. The other men moved through the rooms with inventory eyes, not human ones. Grace did not scream. She packed. Because sometimes the deepest humiliation is not dramatic. It is quiet, timed, and witnessed by strangers. She took what she could think to save under pressure: the silver locket her grandmother had given her, family photographs, a quilt, a few changes of clothes, personal papers. And the small meaningful objects that still felt like extensions of her hand. What she could not pack was harder to leave: the east porch, the rose garden, the oak trees, the rooms that held 5 decades of marriage and routine and care. Thomas drove her himself. That part, somehow, felt crueler than if he had sent someone else. He took her far from Harwick, far from anyone who might recognize her, down roads she did not know and into land that looked increasingly empty. Then he stopped the car, set her suitcase and bag on the dirt, and left her there in the Texas heat like an inconvenience finally disposed of. At 78 years old, Grace Calloway watched the dust settle and understood, with terrible clarity, that she had just been erased from her own life. Grace stood in the road for only a moment after Thomas drove away. Not because she was unshaken, but because there was nothing to be gained by standing still in August heat with no shade, no water, and no certainty that anyone would come looking for her. So she picked up the suitcase in one hand, the smaller bag in the other, touched the silver locket at her throat like a habit older than thought, and began to walk. The road stretched ahead in pale dust and wavering heat. At 78, Grace knew enough about Texas to understand danger when she felt it. The sun was too high. The air too still. Her breathing grew shallow, then dry. But she also knew something else: that panic wastes strength, and strength was now a currency she could not spend foolishly. So she walked as she had managed every hard thing in life, steadily, without drama, one step and then the next. The locket helped. Inside it was the photograph of her grandmother, and on the back were 4 words Grace had carried for decades: keep going. So she did. By the time the open gate appeared, she was beyond fear and somewhere closer to instinct. Beyond it stood a ranch house built low and wide from Texas limestone, with a shaded porch and the unmistakable look of a place that was tended, not neglected. A windmill turned in the distance. The fence posts were sound. Even in her exhaustion, Grace noticed these things. This was not abandonment. This was order. And with the last of her strength, she passed through the gate and walked toward it. Grace stepped into the ranch house expecting emptiness. A quiet kitchen, perhaps. A note. A pitcher of water left by someone who had stepped out. Instead, she stepped into a room that stole the breath from her body. The front room was large and spare in the way well-loved spaces often are: a stone fireplace, wooden floors, plain furniture placed with intention rather than display. Light poured in from above through a skylight, falling clean and cool across the walls. And every wall was covered with her face. Not one portrait. Not 3. Hundreds. Grace at 20, kneeling in a garden with dirt on her hands. Grace in her 30s, laughing at something outside the frame. Grace reading. Grace standing at a window. Grace walking through years she had lived without ever imagining that someone, somewhere, had been paying such impossible attention. There were paintings of her in youth, in womanhood, in age. Formal portraits, quick studies, full scenes, fragments of moments so ordinary and specific that seeing them turned her almost weightless. She knew some of those afternoons. She knew that cardigan. That rose bush. That posture of her hand when she was thinking and didn't know anyone was watching. This was not flattery. It was devotion. The suitcase slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull sound she barely heard. Grace walked deeper into the room slowly, turning in place, tears rising before she had words for why. She felt shock, yes. Confusion, certainly. But beneath both was something stranger and more overwhelming, the unbearable tenderness of discovering that her life had been remembered in detail by someone who had never stopped seeing her. She was still standing in the center of that room, surrounded by the painted evidence of her own life, when she heard the front door open behind her. Grace turned. And the world, which had already become impossible once that afternoon, became impossible again. He stood in the doorway with the stillness of a man who had not expected company and had certainly not expected her. He was old now, as she was old, white-haired, weathered, carrying his years not as decline but as proof of distance traveled. But none of that mattered as much as the eyes. She knew the eyes before she knew anything else. Samuel. The name moved through her like something reopening after decades of being sealed shut. She had been told he died. Not drifted away. Not married someone else. Not chose another life. Died. And because she had loved her father then and still believed him incapable of monstrous deception, she had accepted that death as fact and built the rest of her life around surviving it. Now here he was. Alive. Breathing. Looking at her with the same stunned disbelief she knew must have been on her own face. Grace, he said. Just her name. No explanation. No dramatic speech. Only the sound of it after 57 years, spoken by the man she had once loved before the world told her she must bury that love and go on. Grace's hand rose to the silver locket at her throat as if it might steady her. It did not. Nothing could steady this. Because in one heartbeat, the dead man had become real, and every certainty she had built on top of his loss began to crack. Samuel did not tell the story all at once. He told it the way people tell truths that have lived too long in silence, carefully, piece by piece, watching the other person's face to see what can be born before the next part is spoken. Grace sat across from him in the room full of her own painted life, the silver locket cold in her hand, and listened as the past rearranged itself. He had not died. Her father had made sure she believed he had. Instead of a death notice, there had been a bargain. Money. Pressure. A clear warning that Samuel was to leave town and never come back if he cared at all about what happened to Grace. He had been 23, with no power, no family influence, and no way to fight a man like her father on his own ground. So he left. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he was made to understand that staying would destroy whatever chance either of them had at peace. Grace closed her eyes when she heard that. Not because she doubted him. Because she believed him completely. And belief made the wound sharper. Samuel told her about the years that followed, the ranch, the labor, the long solitude, the teaching himself to paint because memory had to go somewhere and he had no other place to put it. He painted landscapes, commissions, whatever sold. But he also painted her. Not from obsession. From fidelity. From the simple refusal to let the truth of what she had meant to him be erased just because the world had lied. That was the life he built. A life made of work, art, endurance, and remembrance. Grace did not fall back into Samuel's life as if the lost years had simply folded shut. That would have been easier, but it would not have been true. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more profound. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go at first. Then she stayed because leaving no longer made sense. And slowly, day by day, the ranch stopped feeling like refuge and began feeling like possibility. The shock did not vanish. It reorganized itself. Grace woke each morning in a room that was not hers, in a house built by a man she had once loved and mourned as dead, and had to learn again what reality was. She walked the porch in the early hours. She explored the studio. She stood in the doorway watching Samuel paint and realized that the life he had made was not built from bitterness, but from discipline and devotion. That changed something in her. So did the ranch itself. It was orderly, grounded, deeply lived in. Not grand like the Callaway house. honest. Every fence post, every stone wall, every shelf in the studio spoke of a life constructed by hand and kept in good repair. Grace found that calming. After the violence of being displaced, there was relief in a place where everything had been made carefully and nothing was pretending to be more than it was. She and Samuel spoke in long stretches and sat in silence just as often. Neither rushed. Neither demanded. At 78, Grace was not beginning again as a girl begins. She was beginning as a woman who knew the cost of time and the weight of truth. And still, astonishingly, she was beginning. Samuel called his attorney the morning after Grace told him everything. Not because either of them wanted revenge, but because what Thomas had done was too deliberate, too calculated, and too dangerous to leave unanswered. Grace had already been working with Patricia Wells back in Harwick, and Samuel's lawyer, Robert Vance, joined the fight with the calm precision of a man who understood both probate law and the kind of men who believe grieving women are easy to corner. The breakthrough came faster than Grace expected. Robert reviewed the papers Thomas had used and noticed something Patricia had suspected but could not yet prove. The estate filings referenced a document that did not fully match the will submitted for probate. It was a technical inconsistency, but one large enough to pry open the entire case. From there, the hidden truth surfaced. Edward had made a second will. A real one. One prepared by the family's longtime attorney and quietly buried after his death because it did not serve Thomas's interests. In that will, the house and primary estate rights went to Grace, with Thomas provided for separately in ways that were fair but far less convenient than outright control. Once the document was found, the rest began to unravel quickly. The court reopened probate. Thomas's legal position collapsed. And because abandoning a 78-year-old woman on a dirt road in August was not just immoral but criminal, the case widened beyond inheritance into elder abuse and fraud. For the first time since Edward's death, Grace was no longer defending herself. The truth was doing that for her. When the legal dust finally began to settle, Grace did something no one expected. She did not move back into the Calloway house. At least not in the way people assumed she would. She returned once, on a clear spring morning, walking through the front rooms and out to the east porch with the quiet attention of someone revisiting a chapter rather than reclaiming a life. The house was still beautiful. The roses still bloomed. The oak trees still cast their familiar shade. And for a moment, standing there, Grace allowed herself to feel all of it, the 50 years she had spent loving that place, the marriage she had built inside it. The routines and seasons stitched into its walls. But she also understood something new. The house was no longer a home. It was a history. And she did not need to live inside that history forever just because she had once made it meaningful. So Grace made a decision from strength instead of fear. She sold the house. Not as surrender, but as choice. A portion of the money was set aside to secure her future properly, because at 78 she had no interest in romanticizing uncertainty. The rest she directed with care, toward children in need, education, and the beginnings of something new she and Samuel could build together. That choice mattered. Because it marked the final shift in her story. Grace was no longer trying to recover what had been taken. She was deciding, deliberately, what would come next. What Grace and Samuel built together did not look like revenge. It looked like purpose. Once the legal matters were under control and the sale of the Calloway house was complete, they turned toward something neither of them had expected to begin so late in life. A shared work that belonged to the future more than the past. Samuel had the land, the studio, and a reputation that had quietly grown for decades. Grace had organizational instinct, financial clarity, and the kind of steadiness that turns ideals into institutions. Together, they founded the Reyes Arts Foundation. It began simply. A handful of young people from nearby towns, identified by teachers and counselors as talented but overlooked, came to the ranch for instruction. Samuel taught them to see, not just to draw or paint, but to truly observe. Grace handled the schedules, funding, meals, paperwork, and all the invisible structures that allow talent to survive long enough to become skill. The foundation grew because it was real. Not performative generosity, but deeply practical care. At the same time, Samuel's paintings of Grace finally entered the world. A gallery in Austin mounted an exhibition titled Grace, a Portrait in Time, showing decades of her life as he had remembered it, not idealized, but witnessed. Visitors moved through the rooms in near silence, watching one woman age across canvas after canvas, held by attention so constant it became its own form of love. For the first time, the world saw what Samuel had been seeing all along. And Grace, standing in that gallery with him beside her, understood that being truly seen was not a small thing. It was its own kind of home. On an October evening, Grace sat on the porch of the ranch with the silver locket warm in her hand and Samuel beside her, watching the Texas hills turn gold and then blue in the falling light. At 78, she had lost the house she thought would hold the rest of her life. She had been lied to, displaced, humiliated, and made to walk into uncertainty with only what she could carry. And still, she had arrived. Not back at the life she once imagined. At the life that had been waiting for her beneath all the lies. That was the miracle of it. Samuel had not erased her pain, and justice had not erased the years that were stolen. But love, real love, had endured what deception could not destroy. It had waited in paintings, in memory, in a ranch house built by hand, in a man who never stopped seeing her even when he could not reach her. And Grace had done the hardest part. She had kept going. That is what her story proves. Some endings are not endings at all. Some losses tear open the road to what was meant for you long before you were ready to receive it. And sometimes, even at 78, life opens one more gate, and beyond it is not ruin, but the truest home you have ever known.